Hello and welcome to the MovieKing Podcast. My name is David Jurmann and I'll be your host. On today's episode, I'm going to review the film Mufasa: The Lion King. Alright, so let's start off with a couple things to note. One is that I absolutely love the original Lion King. I firmly believe it's one of the best animated films of all time, as well as one of my favorite movies of all time. I've literally watched that movie dozens of times, and each time it just evokes the same emotion out of me. It really just gets to me in a really real way. I just love that film. It's basically perfect to me. Definitely one of Disney's best ever, and you can totally see why it's such a classic. But it always just brings so much to me with these memorable characters, scenes, the dialogue, and music. It's a timeless classic, and I love, love, love that movie. And then you have the 2019 live-action remake, which, you gotta put in quotes, because it's essentially, it's basically an animated film that is photorealistic animals, and the film is basically a copy and paste of the original, but worse in every way possible. Because it's so similar, you can't help but compare the two in every way. And the few changes it does make, I would say, are arguably for the worse. So I'm really not a fan of that movie. I think it just has a lot of problems, and it really just doesn't capture any of the magic the original has. None of the emotion is there. It's a really weird movie. It feels like, my theory is still at the director, Jon Favreau. I really like the guy. He seems like a very good filmmaker and a nice person, but with this movie in particular, I really feel like he was just phoning it in to get, work on Mandalorian done. I don't know if that's the case, but because the work he put in A Jungle Book a few years prior was really solid. I don't really know what happened here, but just the 2019 live-action remake is very bad. And I did just rewatch it a few days ago, actually, because it's been over 5 years since it came out, and I wanted to give it a fair chance again. I thought I didn't really like it at the time it came out, but I was also being a bit more critical on it because I just had the original in mind, and I was, comparing it directly on what it didn't do. So I was like, you know what, I'm gonna give it one more chance. I never really planned on rewatching it, but here I am. I was like, Mufasa's coming out, I'm gonna give it another shot. And honestly, it's even worse than I remembered it being. I couldn't believe how bad it was. The first time I watched it, my initial reaction was it's fine. It's not a good movie, but it's not bad either, because it's literally just the same as the first one, as the original. And rewatching it, all I could think of was it just doesn't do anything as good as the original does. I will say the one thing it does do very well is it is a visual marvel. The movie looks beautiful. It looks like totally photorealistic animals. I think it aged very well in that regard. You could totally convince me these are real animals in the movie just from a still frame or something, or even just a small clip of them moving without any dialogue. And the one scene it does do very, very well is that opening with a circle of life. And whenever the animals aren't talking or really doing anything animated, it feels great. It totally feels right. And maybe that's the pitch they had of this is how we're going to do the movie, and that's what kind of got them on to do it. It really works in that way when you have just no talking, but as soon as the characters have to talk and have to really express themselves, it doesn't work. Because as I'll kind of get to later, photorealistic animals can't emote. Our dogs and cats, they, maybe show a little signs of, maybe they communicate a little bit of emotion, they're sad, they're whining or something, but you can't really see them cry. Animals don't cry the way humans do. They don't, show anger the way humans do. They don't smile, the way humans do. So it loses that, humanity in the expressions from the live-action remake. That's kind of the big problem I have with it. So they just couldn't really emote their 2D animated counterparts. And, because lions don't cry, they don't smile or frown. So it's all these things coming together. So that kind of got me a little worried about how Mufasa was going to turn out. And honestly, when it was first announced, I thought it was going to be just a total cash grab. But then I heard Barry Jenkins was going to direct it. And who is Barry Jenkins, you might ask? Well, I just talked about him last episode. He's the writer and director of some very good movies like Moonlight and If Beale Street Could Talk. He also just wrote the movie The Fire Inside, which is in theaters now. It's a good movie too, actually. I would recommend it. But if you're getting an award-winning filmmaker to do a movie like this, like a movie like Mufasa, that's this big studio movie, like a prequel to a live-action remake that probably wasn't very well received by filmmakers, you have my interest. You kind of piqued my interest in, like, what could he do with this? Is this going to be, like, a really good movie? What is this going to be like? And then on top of that, you have Lin-Manuel Miranda doing the music. And that's a home run in my book. I love the guy's music. I think he's a musical genius. And that was just another cherry on top. But with all of that out of the way, with all that said, how is Mufasa the Lion King as a movie? Well, I'm sad to say that I'm not a fan. Because while it at least has more going for it over its predecessor, the movie still struggles with the core fundamentals and is a largely unnecessary prequel. Before I get into my issues though, let's talk about what works here, because there are a few things I do like. One is that Barry Jenkins does try here. You really feel like he's putting his all into it. He doesn't phone it in. You can tell he's bringing some of his style and techniques to this movie that he's used in previous things. Especially with the way the camera is always moving, like, it just feels like someone is really, like, putting their style into the movie. Like, it doesn't just feel like, a copy-paste original, like, the other Lion King movie did, where it really was just, like, a shot-for-shot remake. Like, this movie feels like it's trying to do something a little different, and I appreciated that. It feels like a different voice is at the helm of it. The performances are also very good, especially from Aaron Pierre, who is on his way to being a star right now. He was super good in the movie Rebel Ridge that came out earlier this year. That was a really great movie too. Highly recommend checking that out. And he's also cast as the DCU's Jon Stewart, a Green Lantern. That's really exciting. I think he'll do a great job in that. And he was very good here too. I just really liked him as Mufasa. He really brought a lot to the role, while not also just being a direct copy of what the late James Earl Jones did. Calvin Harrison Jr. is another standout as Taka and, or slash Scar. And Tiffany Boone does a nice job too as Sarabi. There are some good ideas here too. I especially like some of what this movie does with Mufasa's character, kind of his upbringing, especially how he got some of his skills and how they made him a better leader and a better king in the future. I thought all that was pretty well, established and just kind of brought, a little more to like, oh, why does this movie exist? Why are we telling this story? I thought that was well done. His upbringing was, again, very interesting, and I thought it added nice depth to his character. Especially the way they kind of had him, who he grew up with, I think really just kind of added a lot to his character. And lastly, I did appreciate that the characters were a lot more expressive this time around. I kind of mentioned, earlier that the 2019 Lion King remake was problematic because the lions couldn't emote, and, when you have Simba mourning over his dead father, I think it kind of loses a lot of the impact because, you just don't feel the sadness there. The voice acting is doing a lot of the heavy work, but it's not doing enough to really sell it. In this case, though, it actually, kind of fixed itself a little bit because the characters are a lot more expressive. It sort of works its way into being an issue I have, actually, but the fact that the characters are at least able to show more emotion here in their expressions lets the drama feel a lot less soulless and cold. You really feel a lot more out of it. And I'm glad Barry Jenkins decided to let these, lions actually do show more. They feel a little more animated. It does take away from the, photorealism a bit, but I think the trade-off might be more worth it because of what you get. But kind of moving on to my issues, the first one is that the result of giving the animals more emotion, kind of the trade-off they had to pay, is that a lot of them don't look as convincing and sort of become a little uncanny compared to what we got in the 2019 movie. Like, I think what ends up happening is because the lions are, smiling and stuff, but they look sort of photorealistic, like they kind of look like real lions just on the surface, it just throws your brain off a little bit. At least it did to mine. I was pretty distracted for, a large portion of the movie because it's like, I'm like, why? This animal shouldn't be smiling. I'm glad they're smiling because I'm feeling more now, but I don't know, it was a weird compromise. I wish Barry Jenkins was just able to ignore the 2019 movie and just either return to 2D animation and give this story to like traditional animation or some other look, maybe the hybrid sort of look we got with like Puss in Boots and Spider-Verse, or even something else entirely. I just think that doing the sort of hybrid of like, CGI live action, but still trying to make it look animated a little bit didn't work. I think it just doesn't age as well as the 2019 movie did, even though I kind of prefer the approach this movie has over it. Which leads me to another issue, though. Whether you like it or not, the 2019 remake is canon, and this movie is not following the original as its basis. So, like, the core of this movie is based on the remake, which I don't like. And you might say, like, well, they're basically the same movie. They are very similar, but there are a few, differences kind of established in that remake that follow through here. And there's one line in the remake, that Scar says, which was a new idea. It's kind of like a one-off line if you blink and you miss it. But it's literally a big plot point in this movie. Like, his entire foundation, like Scar's entire motivation for the Lion King is like in a throwaway line in that movie, and then just made a huge part of the story here. And maybe some of this is the result of writer Jeff Nathanson returning from that movie. He did the 2019 remake, he wrote it, and he wrote this movie too, Mufasa. But I honestly just don't like a lot of the decisions he makes for the characters. I think the ones from Mufasa were fine, but when it comes to Scar especially, I think it was really some poor decisions here. I did like some ideas he brought, but the execution of a lot of them was so rushed and forced, especially this one decision with Sarabi that I really disliked. Nathanson also has the script constantly flip back and forth between the main story and then Rafiki, who is telling the story to Simba's daughter, as well as Timon and Pumbaa. And look, I think it works as a way of bringing the present to the past, but the story is often interrupted by unfunny gags that grinds the pacing to a halt. I think as a bridge, it works. Like, if you want to start the movie off with Simba's daughter and Timon and Pumbaa, maybe even want to, like, cut back to them once or twice, that's fine. But the movie does it constantly, and it really hurts the pacing. And just interrupts the flow of the story a lot, and took me out of the film over and over again. Like, I just didn't need the movie to stop the main story so we can see Pumbaa run to take a leak. Like, I just didn't need to see that. It's just, I don't know why we had to keep doing that. I mean, look, I love Timon and Pumbaa. I didn't think the jokes were that funny, so I didn't think it was, like, rewarding enough to keep cutting back to them. That was just really frustrating. And another thing in this movie that was very disappointing is the music. Lin-Manuel Miranda, I mentioned, he's a musical genius. I think, his stuff for Hamilton and The Heights, even stuff in, like, Vivo and Encanto, Moana. I really felt like he was missing in Moana too. Like, I wanted him back really bad. I think he's a great musician, a great musical artist. But I thought the songs in Mufasa were okay at best. There's only one song I liked, and even that one had lyrics that didn't make sense. Like, I don't even really like the song as it is in the movie. It's pretty similar to the live-action remake's choice to have Can You Feel the Love Tonight take place in the middle of the day. Like, it's just that kind of bizarre, like, thinking that maybe it's not the song's fault, but it's just, like, the movie's fault for then, not following through with the lyrics. I don't really know what was made first, the script to the movie or the songs, but one of them is at fault. I just don't think the songs work, though, either way, for the most part. I was very disappointed with them. I love the guy. I was really hoping a few of them would have me, like, humming them on the way out of the theater. Really, just one of them was fine for me, and the others, I just don't really care to listen to any of them again, to be honest. And yet another disappointment in this movie is the villain. He was so one-dimensional and flat. He barely had any development, and as a character, he was not threatening at all. I didn't really feel like he had anything to offer to this story, beyond just kind of being a little menacing a few times. I actually laughed at him a few times. Like, I didn't take him seriously. Like, it just, especially when you're comparing it to, like, Scar, I don't know. Like, in a movie like Transformers 1, which I feel like this movie kind of draws a lot of comparison to in a weird way. That movie just did a very good job because the real meat of the story was like Optimus and Megatron. And then you had this other threat that was like, on the side. And it worked though, because you kind of had enough going on there that it just kind of fit together. In this case though, it puts too much focus on this random side villain that also doesn't really have enough time to get developed. So, I don't know. I don't even really know why he was in this movie. He didn't have anything to contribute to it. So, I didn't really care for that. This movie also has a tendency to constantly reference and tie into The Lion King, which I thought was really unnecessary a lot of the time. Like, you get stuff like, how did Pride Rock come to be? How did Scar get his name? How did Rafiki get his stick? It's all stuff I never asked about or cared about knowing, so the movie feels like it keeps going out of its way to do these things because of fan service and to just please people who love the original. I just thought it was kind of cheap and not impactful at all. And there's one reference in particular that happens twice in the movie that I just facepalmed during. It was so stupid. Like, I really can't believe they did it, and I mean, maybe if they executed it better, it would have been alright, but the impact of what it is, like, what it's trying to foreshadow and what it's trying to say, it was so on the nose. It was just really poorly done. And the fact that they did it twice really killed me because I was just like, why are you so obsessed with this? Like, we know what's going to happen later. I don't know. I just really did not like that point. I don't want to say what it is because it's kind of a spoiler a little bit, but really didn't work for me. And lastly, the way the movie ends just doesn't feel like it successfully bridges this prequel to what happens next in the original Lion King, especially when it comes to Scar and his character. I felt very unsatisfied with how his character arc ended here, especially when, you know where it eventually leads. Like, we all know what happens with Scar, we know what happens with Mufasa, and I just didn't feel like the way these two characters kind of ended the story together, I didn't feel like it was, like, I didn't feel like the bridge was there. Like, I didn't feel like the logical kind of conclusion for these characters was given to us, where we know how much Scar has to hate Mufasa, and we know how much, Mufasa just kind of like, when we know how much Scar hates Mufasa and how much he wants him dead, like, it just didn't add up. Something didn't add up to me. Even if the original movie is years away, it just didn't work for me. And that kind of made this prequel feel even less necessary. So, I don't know. I just think this whole movie is really a sad case where it could have been a lot of fun and an interesting story. There are some moments, especially related to Mufasa's rise and his relationship with Sarabi, that was pretty cool. I will say I also thought Rafiki was a big standout here. He was probably my favorite character in the movie. And it was cool to see more of Rafiki, because he's more of a side character in the first one. But it's just that everything this movie chooses to do with Mufasa's friendship with Scar, and that's kind of what should be at the heart of this movie. So, like, if that doesn't work, the whole movie kind of fails. I just thought what this movie chose to prioritize was not the way to go, and the way it handled Mufasa's friendship with Scar was not satisfying by the end of it. And I thought it was making some huge logical gaps that didn't make any sense. So I found it I found it to be a pretty boring movie to get through. The pacing is terrible, and I just really couldn't get into it. I mean, it's not terrible, like, don't get me wrong, like, I don't think this movie's terrible or anything, but I was just really disappointed by it, knowing what it could have been from the people involved. And even though there's a lot more going for this movie than the 2019 remake it's based on, I similarly don't feel any need to revisit it anytime soon, if at all. So, I'm going to rate this movie a C-. I can only recommend it if you're a major fan of The Lion King, especially the remake, not even like the original, because this movie's really just going off of that remake, and I would just rather rewatch the original any day of the week. But if you also really like Barry Jenkins as a filmmaker and want to see his work, maybe you can check it out for that too. Otherwise, I think you could probably skip it, especially in theaters. If you're going to watch it, you could just stream it on Disney Plus later. I just can't say I liked it. And that about does it for this episode. If you want to follow my reviews, you can find me on Letterboxd at MovieKing1224. You can also listen to this podcast on your favorite apps such as Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Music. If you have any comments or feedback, I would love to hear it and improve the show. And of course, if you've enjoyed this episode, please consider liking, subscribing, and hitting the notification bell to hear more like it. I appreciate you all so much for listening, and I'll talk to you next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.